Hello everyone and welcome to the lecture on Amazon Cognito. So this lecture will contain all these topics. What is Amazon Cognito? User pools, identity pools, user pools in detail, user pool dual role as service provider as well as identity provider, features of Amazon Cognito user pools, then identity pools in detail. Identity pools, there are two types of access control, features of Amazon Cognito identity pools, and feature comparison between user pools and identity pools. So what is Amazon Cognito? Amazon Cognito is a comprehensive cloud-based platform provided by AWS for managing user identities, authentication, and authorization for web and mobile applications. First is user pools. User pools are directories that allow users to sign up and sign in using various methods. It can be username, password, social media, SAML, while identity pools grant users access to AWS resources and services like S3 and DynamoDB. So user pools you can just think of as a directory, and identity pools as a service which grant access to different services like AWS resources, services. So this one is storage and one is giving access, a mechanism to give access. Cognito supports industry standards authentication protocols, enabling seamless integration with existing identity providers and ensuring compatibility across platforms. The service offers multi-factor authentication, risk-based adaptive authentication, and protection against compromised credentials, enhancing the security of user identity and data. Amazon Cognito simplifies user management tasks for developers, allowing them to focus on building applications rather than managing complex identity infrastructure. Cognito integrates seamlessly with other AWS services like Lambda and Pinpoint, providing a comprehensive solution for building and managing applications. With its robust set of features and scalability, Amazon Cognito is an ideal choice for building and managing complex applications in the cloud, accommodating growing user bases and evolving requirements. So let's see what are user pools. So you create a user pool when you want to authenticate and authorize users to your app or API. User pools are a user directory with both self-service and administrator-driven user creation, management, and authentication. Your user pool can be an independent directory and OpenID connect identity provider IDP and an intermediate service provider to third-party providers of workforce and customer identities. You can provide single sign-on SSO in your app for your organization workforce identities in SAML 2.0 and OIDC IDPs with user pools. You can also provide SSO in your app for organizations' customer identities in the public OAuth 2.0 identity stores, Amazon, Google, Apple, and Facebook. User pools do not require integration with an identity pool. From a user pool, you can issue authenticated JSON web tokens directly to an app, a web server, or an API. So basically, to summarize, you have user which will connect to your app first, and then app can ask to request sign in from a user pool, which is a directory, and this directory can also go to some other third party identity provider like using OAuth. It can be Amazon, Google, Facebook, or it can have its own database. Then if there is any additional challenges, it can ask, then challenge responses are provided. Then finally, those token from a user pool goes to your third-party app or the developer app which you have developed, and that app can consume those tokens and allow the user to sign in. And this one more additional thing is this app can provide this access token to your AWS services like API, DynamoDB, and all. And one more thing is this user pool feature in Cognito. There is no need for identity pool. So this is the first feature, and it can stand on its own. Next we'll see identity pools. So you set up an Amazon Cognito identity pool when you want to authorize authenticated or anonymous users to access your AWS resources. So the difference is in this statement it says authorize, but when we were discussing user pools it was authenticate and authorize. So that's why this needs some additional component. An identity pool issues AWS credentials for your app to serve resources to users. You can authenticate users with a trusted identity provider like a user pool, which is Amazon Cognito user pool, or a SAML 2.0 service. It can also sorry for that. It can also optionally issue credentials for guest users. Identity pools use both role-based and attribute-based access control to manage your users' authorization to access your AWS resources. So authorization it uses, so I'll cover this, role-based and access attribute-based, two types. And authorization is basically what you can do, and authenticate is who you are. Identity pools don't require integration with user pool. So this also, if you are using an identity provider outside, it does not require authentication or integration with a user pool. An identity pool can accept authenticated claims directly from both workforce and consumer identity providers. So now let's see user pools in detail. So this is first feature, user pools in detail. So we have seen a bit of both user pools and identity pools. So what is the workflow? But let's see user pools in detail. Amazon Cognito user pools serve as a user directory for your web or mobile applications for users, which allow users to sign in directly through Amazon Cognito. Users can sign in to your app using Amazon Cognito, which are Amazon Cognito local users. So if it is user pool local users, or through a third party identity provider, which are federated users. So there are two types of users. Both local and federated users have user profiles stored in Amazon Cognito user pool. So in case of local, it's only there, this will serve as everything, but federated users, it's still their user profiles, but there's a mapping, it has to map or link the profile from a third party federated system to your local user pool, not your local user pool in general. You can manage and customize user profiles through AWS Management Console, SDK, or AWS CLI. Amazon Cognito user pools can accept tokens and assertions from third-party identity providers. User attributes are collected into JSON web tokens that Amazon Cognito issues to your applications. So when you link, you have user pools and user profiles. So when you link, some attributes can come from the authoritative identity provider, like not in Cognito, and some attribute can be there in the user profile within user pool, and these attributes can be used for your application logic or attribute access control or role-based access control. So in a different ways you can mix these attributes to and they are collected into the JSON web tokens, so that your application can have some decision based on those attributes. So they will consume the JSON web tokens, which basically issue to your application. An Amazon Cognito user pool can serve as a standalone identity provider using OpenID Connect standard to generate JSON web tokens for authentication and authorization. You can implement your own web frontend that calls the Amazon Cognito user pools API to authenticate, authorize, and manage your users. Amazon Cognito supports multi-factor authentication for your users using time-based one-time passwords or SMS messages. User pools help secure your application against access from user accounts that are under malicious control. You can create your own custom multi-step authentication flows to further enhance security and user experience. You can look up users in another directory and migrate them to Amazon Cognito user pools. So these are all features of user pools, which is the first feature. Okay, user pool can also have a dual role as a service provider and identity provider. An Amazon Cognito user pool can also fulfill a dual role both as an service provider. Service provider will basically provide the service to some other identity provider, to your IDPs, like some other identity provider, and it can just serve as a service provider, like a authorization based mechanism, or you can add an IDP to your app, so it can work as an IDP to your consuming application. Amazon Cognito user pools can connect to Amazon Cognito user pools can connect to consumer IDPs like Facebook and Google, or workforce IDPs like Okta and Active Directory Federation services. So when it connects to other IDPs like Facebook, Google, Okta or ADFS, those IDPs will be the IDP, which is the first step, which is providing the identity, basically providing the authentication. So they will authenticate, then Cognito user pool will work as a service provider, and your application will take those tokens from the user pool and consume those applications. So there are three components involved: IDP first, second service provider, which is user pool, Cognito user pool. And those service provider, why we call service provider? Because they help in authorization to your consuming application. Like you have developed some custom web application or mobile app or something, they can consume those token and session management, all those things. They will be using user pool, and user pool will be providing those services. So those services, because of those tokens authorization, that is why in those cases it will be called as service provider. With the OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect tokens that an Amazon Cognito user pool issues, so these are the tokens which I talked about: OAuth 2.0, OpenID Connect tokens. This is issued by user pool. You can accept an ID token in your application, in your consuming application, that authenticates a user and provides the information that you need to set up user profiles. You can accept an access token in your API. You can accept an access token in your API with the OpenID Connect scopes that authorize your users' API calls. And finally, you retrieve AWS credentials from an Amazon Cognito identity pool. So this is for the service. If in case you are connecting with some other application like DynamoDB or something, so you retrieve credentials from identity pool for the short-lived AWS credentials. Basically, this is for to establish session. So they are short-lived session using the secure token service, STS. Now let's see features of Amazon Cognito user pools. So we are still talking about the first user pool, which is basically your directory. So all the detail, like all the features one by one. So first is OID Connect IDP, which issue ID tokens to authenticate users. Then authorization server, issue access tokens to authorize user access to APIs. SAML 2.0 service provider, transform SAML assertions into ID and access tokens. Then OpenID Connect service provider, which transform OpenID Connect tokens into ID and access tokens. OAuth 2.0 service provider, which transform ID tokens from Apple, Facebook, Amazon or Google to your own ID and access token. Authentication front-end service, which is used for sign up, manage and authenticate users with hosted UI. API support for your own UI. Create, manage and authenticate users through API request in supported AWS SDKs. Multi-factor authentication, you can use SMS messages, one-time passwords, time-based one-time passwords, or your user's device as an additional authentication factor. Security monitoring and response, secure against malicious activity and insecure passwords. Customize authentication flows, you can build your own authentication mechanism or add custom steps to existing flows. Groups, you can create logical grouping of users and a hierarchy of IAM role claims when you pass tokens to identity pools. Customize ID tokens, you can customize your ID tokens with new, modified and suppressed claims. Then customize user attributes, you can assign values to user attributes and add your own custom attributes. So these are all exhaust all complete feature list of Amazon Cognito user pools, which is, you can think of user directory. So next we'll see identity pools, which is the second major feature of Cognito. So an identity pool is a collection of unique identifiers or identities that you assign to your users or guests. Identity pools authorize identities to receive temporary AWS credentials. When you present proof of authentication to an identity pool in the form of a trusted claim from a SAML 2.0, OpenID Connect, or OAuth 2.0 social identity provider, you associate your user with an identity in the identity pool. So this is what I talked about, linking. So you have, let's say, Facebook or OpenID Connect service. The user has to be there in the identity pool so that it can link. The token that your identity pool creates for the identity can retrieve temporary session credentials from AWS Security Token Service, AWS STS. Identity pool complement authenticated identities by allowing you to configure AWS access without IDP authentication. You can offer your own custom proof of authentication, which is developer authenticated identities or no authentication, unauthenticated identities. So this is additional feature. So authenticated identities are basically the first one, where you have some other identity provider, but you can have developer authenticated identities. So this will be short lived, but this can have a claim to your consuming application. You can configure an identity pool to authorize AWS access without requiring IDP authentication. With unauthenticated identities, you can grant temporary AWS credentials to any app user who requests them. Identity pools also accept claims and issue credentials based on your own custom schema with developer authenticated identities. So think of something like some kind of anonymous user but short-lived session. So in those cases also your identity pools will work. So basically this is an authorization service, but it can also help in certain use cases such as unauthenticated identities and developer authenticated identities. So identity pools, there are two access control types. One way to integrate Amazon Cognito identity pools with IAM policies is through role-based access control, which is RBAC. The other method is using attributes for access control, which involves mapping user attributes to principal tags in temporary sessions. These two features, RBAC and ABAC, can be used together or individually depending on your requirements. When a user passes claims to the identity pool, Amazon Cognito selects the appropriate IAM role to request based on those claims. To tailor the permissions of each role to your specific needs, you apply IAM policies to them. For example, if a user is in the marketing department, they receive credentials for a role with policies designed for marketing access needs. With attribute-based access control, the identity pool reads attributes from the user's claims and maps them to principal tags in the user's temporary session. So let's say IAM resource-based policies allow deny access. So let's say you have IAM policy which is resource-based. So based on session tags, you can configure, for example, let's say in the principal you are passing the value as marketing, and your Amazon S3 bucket permits read operations only when the department tag has a value of marketing. So this will come from your identity pool session, and this will get mapped to your S3 bucket based on the value which is let's say if it has a department tag which has a value of marketing in the S3 bucket. So bucket will check whether the session has this cookie token or attribute, and the tag name and the value is same as what you have configured as the S3 bucket policy. Okay, now features of Amazon Cognito identity pools. So let's see detail all the features. So Amazon Cognito User Pool Service Provider. This is used to exchange an ID token from your user pool for web identity credentials from AWS Secure Token Service (STS). SAML 2.0 Service Provider, to exchange SAML assertions from web identity credentials from AWS STS. OpenID Connect Service Provider, exchange OpenID Connect tokens for web identity credentials from AWS STS. OAuth 2.0 Service Provider, exchange OAuth tokens from Amazon, Facebook, Google, Apple and Twitter for web identity credentials from AWS STS. Custom Service Provider, with AWS credentials, exchange claims in any format for web identity credentials from AWS STS. Unauthenticated Access, issue limited access web identity credentials from AWS STS without authentication. Role-based access control, choose an IAM role for your authenticated user based on their claims and configure your roles to only be assumed in the context of your identity pool. Attribute-based access control, convert claims into principal tags for your AWS STS temporary session and use IAM policies to filter resource access based on principal tags. Okay, let's see now to summarize feature comparison between user pools and identity pools. So first feature, OpenID Connect Identity Provider. So user pool offers this feature. Then API Authorization Server and user pool has this feature. IAM Web Identity Authorization Server. So this is part of identity pool. This feature is part of identity pool. Then SAML 2.0 Service Provider and OpenID Connect Identity Provider. So this is part of user pool. OpenID Service Provider and OpenID Identity Provider. Again, this is part of user pool. Then OAuth 2.0 Service Provider and OpenID Connect Identity Provider. So again, user pool, it's part of user pool. SAML 2.0 Service Provider and Credentials Broker. So this is part of identity pool. OpenID Connect Service Provider and Credentials Broker. Again, this is part of identity pool. OAuth 2.0 Service Provider and Credentials Broker. Again, this is part of identity pool. Amazon Cognito User Pool Service Provider and Credentials Broker. Again, this is part of identity pool. Custom Service Provider and Credentials Broker. Again, this is part of identity pool. Authentication front-end service. This is part of user pool. So you will just observe one pattern. So as I talked about, identity pool is like a broker. So all the broker is coming. So this is a middleman. So that's why this is all yes. And wherever this is talk about, let's say authentication or identity provider, this is part of user pool. And something like authorization server, identity pool. And again, IDP is for user pool, user pool, user pool. So this is a common pattern. API support for your own authentication UI. So this is part of user pool because authentication. Multi-factor authentication, user pool. Security monitoring and response, user pool. Customize authentication flows, user pool. Groups feature is part of user pools. Customize ID tokens, user pool. AWS Web Application Firewall, Web ACLs, part of user pool. Customize user attributes, part of user pool. Unauthenticated access. So this is part of identity pools because this is for temporary token, session tokens. Role-based access control, again part of identity pool because this is a broker or the middleman which provides, which maps your identity to the role in the IAM roles. And lastly, again attributes based access control. So this is part of again identity pool. So just remember which feature belongs to where. As I again summarize, if it has to do with authentication, identity providing, or some kind of core feature, authentication or something, that will part of guest will be a user pool. But if it's something like middleman, authorization, or some kind of mapping like access control, that will become the part of identity pool. And that's all. Thanks for watching.